Open banking, I think of as just really the idea more than anything else that APIs would exist to use for banking and both sides, right? Both APIs that I can deliver bank data from my banks and also APIs I can use to do financial transactions through my fintech apps or Apple Pay or Venmo or any of those big players. And actually the industry is starting to move towards the term open finance from open banking and actually expand that even further.
I'm Jason Harmon, and this is API Intersection, where you'll get insights from experienced API practitioners to learn best practices on things like API design, governance, identity, auth, versioning, and more. Welcome back to API Intersection. As always, I'm your host, Jason Harmon, CTO at Stoplight. And as of this week that we're recording this, so maybe a bit before you hear it, a part of SmartBear. So it's an exciting new feature. Hopefully by now you've already heard an episode talking about it. But I got to get used to how to introduce that. At any rate, I was actually just this week at a Fintech conference catching up with old PayPal pals and that sort of thing. And so I got Fintech a little bit uploaded in my brain, which is great because we're really honored to have Clyde Cutting today with us, who I don't even know how to describe the scope of what you're doing here, Clyde. So you tell us, what do you do in kind of the Fintech world?
Thanks. I actually have worked with the big banks in open banking APIs for 5, maybe going on 6 years now. So really on the provider side of making customer data available securely to whatever financial application they're interested in using.
Nice. So I know for Stoplight and kind of my day job, the last few years, especially with kind of pandemic kicking in, was this huge acceleration of opening up platforms, lots of APIs, especially we saw a lot in the financial industry as well as insurance. But I guess in that 5-6 years, give us an idea of, I guess, what you're referring to for folks who maybe aren't in the fintech space and don't hear about this stuff all the time. And B, how far have we come? Where is it going?
Yeah, that's actually a great story. 5 or 6 years ago, if you wanted to connect your bank account or your bank account data to any other application, you had to share your credentials. And the banks didn't have APIs available, so they used screen scraping to use your credentials to log into your bank and do whatever it is you asked them to do. So that meant anytime you used a fintech application, you were spreading your username and password somewhere else in the world. And anytime you change it, of course, you would have to update all those places in the world. I'm not aware of any specific significant breaches in fintech land, so that's good news, and we'll cross our fingers on that. But it's been a big and growing concern for the major banks. That security, obviously is, takes security out of their hands, right, and puts it in the hands of hundreds and thousands of other platforms, which is not a good thing if you're a bank and trying to protect people's money. And it's also, of course, become a concern of the federal regulators, who I think in October of this year are supposed to issue, CFPB will issue some rulings or guidance on how banks should secure their information, or open banking interactions in general should be secured. And we expect that to include a upcoming prohibition against sharing of credentials for use of screen scraping.
That's fantastic news from a security standpoint. I guess if you're listening and you're like, why is passing my username and password around a problem? Hopefully that's pretty obvious to you, but we want to minimize the number of times that information gets passed around, especially to our bank accounts. So that's great. I guess when you refer to open banking, there's been, I have a weird view on it probably. So I'd love your just idea of what that means in more practical terms. And I think you gave us some hints there that this is about banks opening things up, but are we talking about a standard? Are we talking about a framework? Are we talking about a toolkit? What's the practical assets that folks would interact with?
Yeah, so open banking, I think of as just really the idea more than anything else that APIs would exist to use for banking and both sides, right? Both APIs that I can deliver bank data from my banks and also APIs I can use to do financial transactions through my fintech apps or Apple Pay or Venmo or any of those big players. And actually the industry is starting to move towards the term open finance from open banking and actually expand that even further as right maybe my investments you wouldn't strictly call them banking, but we would call them part of my financial activities. What's my payroll? How do I exchange information about my income to to underwrite me for a loan request, et cetera. So I really think of it as the idea that we will use APIs to exchange data. Now, right on the heels of that, right, immediately or even upfront, is that they have to be secure, right? We have to use the very latest in OAuth or FAPI for financial, you know, higher grade of security level in financial world, et cetera. So tie those together, and that's where the Financial Data Exchange Consortium really has been trying to lead the US based industry to keep up with, or even in some cases surpass, what the rest of the world is doing, both in terms of availability of APIs and their security.
So if I'm working at, say, a financial institution and I've got to go, my project is to go build APIs, am I going to reach to one of these places to sort of follow a particular set of design guidelines or something?
Well, the way the industry started, right, with screen scraping is that there were some large players that provided that capability. So if I wouldn't have to learn how to read the websites of the 11,000 plus financial institutions in the United States, I would go to somebody that has done that and can do that for me. So the biggest player there is Plaid and Finicity and Yodlee and half a dozen others. So as a fintech, I would look to one of those intermediaries as my source for connecting my customers to their bank accounts.
If I'm at one of the banks rather than these intermediaries and I'm going to go build an API, is there sort of design standards that I'm going to go plug into rather than invent my own APIs?
Yep. Well, and that's exactly the role of financial data exchange. And the driver on the bank side, right, is that that's where the big security risk is for screen sharing and sharing of credentials. And so I've worked at a couple of big banks in this area, and that's really their major concern. How much screen scraping traffic are we seeing on our website? How do we move that off to APIs? So that question then is, what data are my my customers' use of fintech apps scraping off the website, and how do I make that available in APIs? So Wells Fargo, that I previously worked at, was one of the early players, and there weren't really any standards at that time, and so they designed APIs that made sense to them and fit their fintech app customer needs. But they played a major role along with some of the other large banks in the US, to, Chase especially has played a big role to establish this financial data exchange as an industry-led consortium, partially to answer that question: what are the APIs that we can deliver? What is the security concerns around delivering them safely? And what data should be in them, right? Because the data itself also has some security concerns, right? I don't want to be sending my customers' social security numbers in plain text, for instance, or even their account numbers or credit card numbers in the clear. So that is 6 maybe years old that financial data exchange really got kicked off the ground, and it's seeing a lot of traction now. And financial data exchange claims over 200 members. About a third of those are financial institutions, but they also have consumer advocacy groups, fintech firms, et cetera. So, the whole ecosystem of financial data and financial products in the US. And they, through those member firms and the APIs and traffic that the member firms are providing to their customers, to their external party fintechs on behalf of their customers, They think 53 million accounts in the US are now secured and providing data through APIs rather than screen scraping, which is, I think it's maybe half of the eligible target. Maybe it's not as big as half, but if you count 11,000 financial institutions and all their customer accounts, I don't know what that number is, but it's a good part of the way there.
Yeah. So I guess when we look forward to the future with some of this stuff, if these things are successful, and obviously it's pretty successful numbers you're throwing out already, if I'm writing some code to integrate with a given bank, would I expect that I could then reuse that code and point to other banks and get basically the same functionality in a portable way with like one code base?
Again, part of the idea that financial data exchange is working towards a uniform standard. We know that banks are going to have their own additional requirements in many cases. And as I talked about, the aggregator layer there allows fintech apps to select a single partner that can handle all or the bulk of those integration concerns. That leaves then the question of how to integrate across all the different banks in the hands of the aggregators. It doesn't mean it goes away, but there are fewer people that really have to deal with that. Financial Data Exchange is holding a conference this fall, or a seminar this fall, on their certification process and how they are starting up a way that financial institutions and fintech apps can certify that their API and financial data traffic is both secure, meets the security requirements, and meets the data requirements. So you get that kind of integration that you're talking about on both sides of the interaction.
So, when we look back through the history of industries trying to standardize on how to connect and integrate things, a lot of times these things end up being kind of big and bloated and top heavy and designed by committee in its classic sense. So I guess, and I mean, I even, I got enough gray hair in my beard to look back at like the SOA era, and we had all this stuff, right? Like there were soap standards for virtually every industry at some point, and just overnight, no one cared because it was gross. So I'm curious when you look at kind of this new movement again to kind of, it's been 20 years, let's try again. Like, why is this maybe different?
Well, I'm glad you asked the question. I started first working in services when it was XML over HTTP, and then we had Corba, which didn't last very long, and Microsoft came out with the SOAP standard, and that actually lasted quite a while and is still in use in a lot of places. One nice thing about SOAP is it gives you very formalized environment to strictly define APIs. And that is super helpful, especially as you're just getting into APIs when your flexibility is not a friend. But REST has really, superseded that, obviously. I should mention, I've also done work with CICS transactions, interfacing as uh, services to mainframes, right? So
Right?
there's all of the,
What
yeah,
is CICS for folks listening? Was that what you're saying is like mainframe interface?
it's a mainframe interface definition. It's kind of a fixed length format, file transfer kind of format. I think where the real advantage of RESTful APIs and JSON is that it doesn't have the fragility of SOAP and XML. That in fact, the API JSON schema defines additional properties as valid, and XML that is not at all valid. So that lets us not have to version as often to make valuable changes in place, let people consume which parts of an API that they use and ignore other parts without having to code to them because they exist.
And not everything's a post
Not
from an
everything's a post.
HTTP standpoint. You
Right.
get to cache.
Yep. Right. That you get more flexibility in using different verbs, et cetera. And the resource orientation helps a lot too, that you can think of what you're interacting with as an object, right? If we think about object-oriented programming, it's an entity that I can think of as interacting with independently of the fact that I'm using APIs to do that.
But here's an interesting thought, and this has been kind of like part of my talk track this year, is like reflecting on that era and seeing all these standards that came about, and lots of things got built on. Soap itself was prescribed to us by the largest companies who decided for the rest of us how we were going to communicate. And rest, I think, has become a lot more of a pervasive concept these days, in part because it's been sort of a bottoms up grassroots movement in a lot of ways. It wasn't a standard defined by anybody. It's not a standard at all, right? It's just a pattern that some smart folks came up with, and other smart folks jumped on board with. And even the conventions of what we say makes a good API was not determined by any big companies. Now, I'm not suggesting that I think banks should have a grassroots movement from developers to define how they do business, but I guess I worry sometimes with the emergence of these new big standards. And again, I think fintech's leading the way, banking's leading the way in some fashion. Um, do we have a healthy balance with sort of what developers need out of this versus what the banks need or what regulators need?
That's an interesting question. And I would add to your historical view, right, that the rise of REST and flexibility in services kind of parallels the rise in open source, right? So it's, in some sense, it's
Absolutely.
open
Absolutely.
source
It's all the same thing in terms of community building and decentralization. Completely agree.
tool creation and developer support, et cetera. We didn't even have the term developer experience until quite recently. In terms of standards, that flexibility that we talked about in JSON is sort of what makes it palatable, right? So financial data exchange has, I was just looking at it the other day and counting up what our schema looks like. And we have a dozen different files with over 15,000 lines of APIs and entity definitions, et cetera. How do you deal with that kind of thing? Well, first of all, you don't implement all of it, right? Nobody's going to implement all of it. And an account has dozens, if not 100 different attributes that can be passed back. Each bank is not going to return all that data. And so that's where, as a standard, it still retains flexibility that I can still implement what's important to me. If as a developer, right, or a fintech, right, I need one that's added to the FDX API recently is account open date, right? And if I'm checking my balance, I don't necessarily care when I have an account open date. But if I'm doing loan underwriting, that's maybe an important feature. And so for my use case of loan underwriting as a developer, I'm going to need to communicate with the banks on behalf of adding that piece of the standard to their API so that I can help them sell more loans.
So if we turn our heads away from, let's say, developer community into, we got a consortium. There's a group of companies getting together and deciding essentially how to work together, how to work with the rest of the industry. And you've been involved in that pretty heavily. Um, what's hard about that, and what's made it work, right? Like, how did you get past? Because the track record of groups like this is not always great, right? It's often pretty ugly.
Yeah. It's hard in different ways, right? So if we look at the world, Europe and I think Australia, maybe some other pockets, have really gone a federal route, right? So the standards are set by federal regulation, right? So that is not a model for increased flexibility. In North America, the U.S. we're waiting on standards. We think that the regulators will defer to FDX or other industry groups rather than set it all in stone in the U.S. Given the example of 53 million customer accounts that are now exchanging data securely instead of through screen scraping, and in Canada, it's a little bit of a mix. They are looking to FDX standards, but they have set more firm regulations about banks shall use this standard and do so in this way. And I'm not a Canadian expert, but they're a little bit ahead of the U.S. regulators in terms of enforcing the standard or stating that the standard should be followed.
I think you make a great point that, like, to some extent, the worst case scenario is that government determines technology standards, and that we're better off coming together as companies to do it. Um, I guess in the course of coming to decisions together, like, what's difficult about that? And I guess where my head is at is, if I'm working in a different industry vertical and looking to this big movement in fintech, how can we emulate some of this success for other industries?
So, yeah, so that in some ways, I've been really pleased. So I got involved with financial data exchange in about 2018, late 2018, early 2019, when I was working at Wells Fargo, and Wells Fargo noticed that their customer tax forms was some of the biggest areas of remaining of screen scraping data, right? So once a year, I need to get my 1099s or 1098s from the bank and send them to my tax advisor. And I'm sharing my credentials to do that because I don't want to have to schlep the paper or documents around. But FDX at its beginning, was bank account focused, and so it didn't have a robust tax schema. So I got involved at that time and to saying, hey, we need tax schemas at the big bank I worked for. How do we do that? And was a little surprised, but pleasantly so, to say, well, you build them and tell us what they are, and we'll adopt them, right? And that in the financial data exchange case, right, is very different than what I've seen in ISO standards or IETF standards or W3C standards, where it's international and decision making can take years, and standards are implemented and followed even for years before they're officially approved, et cetera. In the financial data exchange case, any member is able to propose an RFC for changes to the API. And so I worked with really two other guys closely, and we built 54 different schemas for tax, IRS tax forms, and said, here they are, let's put them all together. Just glance at that number. That's 5,000 lines of API code. I don't expect that anyone in the consortium read that line by line other than the three of us, but we made our case and it was adopted by Financial Data Exchange. So in that sense, financial data exchange standards really feel open source to me, right? I can make a contribution. It's not exactly a pull request, but the group approves it and merges it if it's appropriate to do so.
I love that. I think that's exactly, I think, what I was fishing for in all of this is, like, how is this different than, I think, W3C, IETF, some of these things where it's like, yeah, big, long, complicated, designed by committee things. But yeah, three smart folks who do this for a living getting together and agreeing on some things, and then the broader group giving it a, cursory review and going, yeah, this looks good. Like,
Yep.
that's how good stuff happens, right? So it sounds very promising.
Now, I do want to add that there's also some formal review that goes on, which doesn't happen by all 220 members. And
Sure.
as I mentioned, I got involved to deliver this large block of tax API stuff. And right at that time, the person who had been sort of the primary committer was migrating out of FDX. He had other work commitments. And so I ended up being slotted into as the co-chair of the authoring task force that really has its eye on, bringing the, in some sense, formality, but at least, consistency and accuracy and ensuring that the API meets the intent in ways that API definitions have real meaning and impact, and you can't be too informal about how that looks, even if the process of submitting changes to them is informal. So we actually do line by line review of all the changes that are
Sure.
requested.
Yeah, I wasn't suggesting, I shouldn't have said cursory. I'm sorry. I'm sure it's quite formal and thorough. Um, having been involved in some open source work and standards and things like that myself, I think this is, to me, like, the important message of this kind of thing is, um, you can have a lot of members in something, you can have a lot of people, at the periphery, but at the end of the day, it's usually some primary kind of core committer type personas who are really carrying the torch for these things. And I think for folks who really know something well and feel like, yeah, I could lead a discussion on defining this for our space, or at least take a first shot at it. And I think this is happening in a lot of industries right now. These things are forming. Is don't count on the fact that there's some mob of experts who are going to do it. It's going to take someone's passion to see these things through. So I thank you for the encouraging story there. That I'm sure some folks go like, "Oh, great, an industry consortium!" Like, bore me to death. But I think that's the inspiring bit, and I really appreciate you sharing the story with us. And it's been great to chat with you today.
Thank you much, Jason. Appreciate it, and congratulations to you and Stoplight on the merger with SmartBear.
Thank you so much. Thanks for listening. If you have a question you want to ask, look in the description of whichever platform you're viewing or listening on, and there should be a link there so you can go submit a question, and we'll do our best to find out the right answer for you.